Mr. Frank. That is our last request to speak, so we'll close it to the public and bring it back to the board. The supervisor of the district actually asked to lead here. I know Supervisor Meacham has a comment as well.
Yeah, my main sense of trying to see where we're headed is what we want to accomplish, because I'm not, as much as I appreciate all the comments today, I don't really see what we would gain from doing another study that shows us how much how much we would lose. You know, we have a study from three studies actually that show us the economic impact of the power plant now, and even its multiplier effects on the economy, as we've heard from other folks as well. So we do a study that basically says minus that. I'm not really, you know, I don't think, the truth is in economic development, you cannot plan for the closing of a major employer. No city can, regardless of whether you see it coming and you've planned or not. It's not the way things work in our economy. To my sense, meaning that if for some reason, whether it would be something bad or a corporate decision or a federal decision to close the plant anytime between now and the end of its current license, we wouldn't be able to plan for that regardless, because the losses, the economic losses, are not something that, you know, we could put plans and say attract Microsoft. Great, it's not going to happen. Attract, you know, you can't do that. I mean, basically, so I don't want to see us like entertain an exercise in purely hypothetical, speculative ways that we might be able to replace an impact on this level with something else. That's why we have an economic development strategy actually through the EVC. And there are a lot of things that we might be able to identify. It seems to me that the only way you can ever prepare for transitions, and there is an inevitable transition in our economy at some point with the closing of Diablo Canyon, whenever that occurs, but the only way you can actually plan for it is to basically continue to strengthen your economy now, and to do things that we've already identified in the economic development strategy and some other things perhaps that, you know, continue to diversify the local economy and that can continue to provide opportunities to collaborate with the private sector, with Cal Poly and Cuesta and other areas, but to just kind of, we could spend $50,000 and find out what we already know, that if Diablo Canyon were to close tomorrow, this is how much of an impact it would have. It might be gradual over a certain period of time. Ron Alsop would have to drive a older car, whatever it is, but I don't really know what that gets us. You know, to me, I'd rather sort of look at it from the perspective of, all right, what can we do, if we'd like to do, to continue to strengthen our local economy so that when that inevitable transition occurs, it isn't going to be devastating like it is when a community loses a car plant, a community loses another major anchor. You know, this is the only anchor employer that we have that's in the private sector, so it's not something that we can duplicate in a plan and say, well, we just attract another one. That doesn't, you know, what we've discovered actually through the economic development plan and through the you know, the people who've been involved in it have provided a lot of information, and through companies that have stayed, is that retention is the most important aspect. Helping our companies that are growing to continue to grow and stay here is really what works in a community like ours, not trying to fish out, you know, companies that might relocate here because we have nice weather or whatever it is. So I'm hoping that we can move to, you know, the only thing that I really have great questions about, and I don't even know if there's a possibility to find out, is how we can somehow come up with criteria to figure out the effects and impacts of waste on our community, both now and in the long term.
Maybe we can get to that. And
but I don't know that has anything to do with the economic plans about Diablo Canyon one way or another.
I know Supervisor Meacham has another framing comment that he'd like to make here.
Maybe I missed the whole point of this. This had nothing to do with closing Diablo Canyon down, the extension of the licensing. I think it's almost like our 7-year pain plan. If you don't make people aware of what you have and what the possibilities are, and if something were to happen, some of you would be right back in this room saying, why didn't you plan for this? What were you going to do about it? That was my reason for hoping that we would at least engage in a discussion to make people aware of it, and I think we just did that. The awareness is out there now. Everybody can deal with it however they want to, but I mean, for example, I mentioned the schools. I would think the schools would have some type of an economic strategy to address the issue if in fact it were to, for some ungodly reason, were to close down. I don't want it to close down either. It's a great economic engine for this county. It provides great jobs. I understand the construction industry. I was in it for 20 years. And that's not the point. What would you do if it weren't here? Where would you train your folks and where would you send them if that happened? I think that just making people aware of the vital economy that it does provide is a good thing. But what happens if? And I think if we don't answer those questions, I think we're not doing our job. And I don't think we need to pursue another economic study of whatever the case may be. I think we've provided that information for all the different entities to take a look at it and say, okay, well, what could we do or what should we do? Do we have a backup plan? I always use the Mack truck test. You walk outside, you get hit by a Mack truck, who takes your place and what do? I think it's important to have these kind of planning in place. We did that with a 7-year pain plan. I think that the worst thing that can happen is the issue of complacency. If everybody becomes complacent and thinks that everything is just wonderful and fine and we don't have to back up plan for anything, I don't think that that's a good idea. And as far as the issue about the corporate decisions, they don't really care, they just look at the dollars, I don't agree with that. I think that they have to look at the safety aspect of it, otherwise they won't be in business. So I guess I'm missing the point about the argument about are they a good economic engine? Absolutely, that's unquestionable. Do they provide good jobs? Are they a good neighbor? You bet. But what if? And I think that was the whole point of saying, let's look at this economic study to say, what do they provide? Who does it affect? And then you figure it out from there.
Interesting. I think that's going to start a good discussion. Ms. Ray.
Well, Supervisor Meacham hit it on the nose, of course. But to piggyback that and to echo what Craig Schmidt said, it's not a question of if but when. And pessimists might say that when could be tomorrow based on a corporate decision, or maybe that will be lack of relicensing and that'll be in 24, 25, or maybe they'll get relicensed and it'll be 20 years from now. But in any case, do we know what that provides for us economically now? And that's the question in front of us, and the answer is yes. Now, with regard to, I wanted to talk about EVC and its role in this study and going forward. And I think we need to underscore that. And I'm sorry that Mike Manchek isn't here to speak to this today. But, I may be new to this board, but I'm not new to EVC, having sat on that board for several years. And it's important to note that EVC isn't just tasked with this, with solving this problem in the future, but they've been working on this issue of diversifying our economy and finding head of household jobs across the county already for years. And it's also important to note that they've done an unprecedented amount of work in achieving some horizontal cooperation between people in the same industries that are traditional competitors, but working together to further the diversification of our economy and the strengthening of our local economy. So with that work and the work that the county's doing here and the EVC vis-a-vis the business community, involving the business community in governmental decisions, that's how we will attack the possibility and the probability and the inevitability of the future. So again, just to kind of sum that up, the question before us today is, do we accept this existing study? Do we ask for a peer review, or do we commission an independent consultant? And I think we've found out what we wanted to know from this study. I'm not in favor of spending any more money on a study of this kind of what if picture. I'm more in favor of going forward with continuing the partnership with EVC and making sure that we can strengthen our local economy to be able to do whatever we can to absorb this when this occurs.
Thank you, Ms. Ray. Ms. Arnold.
Yes, I just had a few comments too, and it's been my observation for nearly 30 years, really a generation, that PG&D has done a very good job of fulfilling its responsibilities, and I would call those responsibilities keeping our community safe through the life of the Diablo power plant, delivering power to its customers, and also it has a responsibility to its shareholders and financial benefit to its shareholders. And I always think about that when we're talking, our county is so unique, but the demographics of our county, there are many parts of this county the demographics, there's a huge population of retired folks that depend somehow or another on a investment portfolio that very often includes corporate companies like PG&E. So those are the things we don't think about when we're just kind of looking at what's immediately in front of us. We don't really have full control other than trying to support PG&E's efforts in fulfilling its responsibilities. So I agree with my colleagues. Our job up here is to continue to try to diversify our local economy, support private sector business, and work along just trying to keep ourselves informed and our responsibility to our constituents, trying to maneuver along so that we are as prepared as we can be. And I think that's the key, as prepared as we can be. So I look forward to working with PG&E as a partner in the community for many years to come, and appreciate that partnership.
Thank you, Ms. Arnold. Let me offer a couple comments and see if we can frame some direction to staff off of the comments. I do think Mr. Meacham focused our attention where it needs to be, which is on the what if, and Mr. Buckshire actually led us into this with that this is a question of risk mitigation, independent of what you think about the benefits or the detriments of nuclear power as a way of generating electricity. We have to imagine difficult scenarios here. It's a responsible thing for us to do. And as we look at this risk mitigation issue, to me there are two components. One of them is the probability that a closure is going to happen, and the other is the response should a closure actually occur. And I do think there's work for us to do on both sides of that equation, and it's things that I'd like to make some suggestions. If we look at the risk, what are the risks to the closure of Diablo Canyon? We've talked over the last year or two previous about the physical risk, about the natural hazard that might be posed by the seismically active area and that it sits in, and we're working on that. The other is an economic risk, which is coupled with the third category, which is a regulatory risk. And that economic risk is actually at the root of a number of closures of plants that have occurred. Mr. Weissman referenced them, that a number of the plants that have closed in the last year it has been an economic decision. It's not a broken power plant like San Onofre, although you could cast that as an economic decision. It simply was going to cost too much money to fix San Onofre, and that's why SCE decided to close it. So as we look at the economic coupled with the regulatory risk, the regulatory aspect of this is almost completely out of the control of this Board of Supervisors. I think for all practical purposes, the regulatory side is out of the control of this Board of Supervisors. But in terms of the economy of generating nuclear power, I do think that there is a place for at least a peer review of some aspects of the study that we've been discussing today, looking at, in particular, the economics of the NRC's post-Fukushima requirements. The NRC is in the process now of developing things that it is going to require nuclear plants to do as a result of their study of the Fukushima disaster. That's going to play into the economics of running every nuclear power plant in this country. The other side of that is basically the price of energy, the regulation of the cost of energy, the market for energy, which is changing as renewable energy sources come on board, and as the price of natural gas continues to be very, very low. The economy of running a nuclear power plant is changing. And so I think as I looked through the economic analysis that was commissioned by PG&E, it seemed to me that there needed to be a broader consideration of the economic context in which nuclear power operates. And that feeds into our sense of what's the risk that either regulation or economic decisions are going to close this plant. So that's why I would suggest a little more work. I'm not talking about a whole new study, but I think a little more context for what's happening in nuclear power would be useful. On the other side of the risk mitigation is what is our response should a closure occur. And, you know, I agree. Supervisor Arnold, you know, indicated, you know, about job training. You know, you can't create job opportunities in a vacuum, having them sitting there waiting for folks to train up and then take them. It's really hard to imagine gearing up replacement jobs if people are laid off from Diablo Canyon in the kind of time frame that would be available as those jobs were considered for termination. Those time frames are very different. But as I look in terms of our county's response, I think first and foremost, this county as an organization needs to take responsibility for its own operation. We've seen that the unitary tax is a significant, though not perhaps overwhelming, aspect of our budget as a whole. It is a significant, nearly 80% aspect of our emergency services office. And as such, I think it's incumbent upon this Board of Supervisors to consider whether we have sufficient reserves in place to mitigate a short lead time shutdown. For a long time, we've had what we call the general reserve, which sits, if I remember correctly, at $8 million. That's money out of the general fund set aside for natural disaster or other sorts of unexpected events, among other things. And in conversations with our CAO, one thought has been that it's been at $8 million for a long time. As our budget has grown, it might be time to start thinking about increasing that general reserve. I would advocate that we should increase it and perhaps designate some of it as a reserve that is specifically under the situation of the potential closure of Diablo Canyon. We have seen nuclear power plants close much more quickly than communities expected. And so I think it's prudent that our staff review our reserves and consider what Diablo Canyon means to this county's operation in terms of a reserve setback. The other two responses are one is short-term and one is long-term. So the question is, if we were faced with the potential closure of the plant in a one-year time frame, what would this county do in the short term as a means of mitigating that significant loss? You know, whether it's more money to job training, whether it's some kind of adjustment of taxes or fees or other things that we have control over. But I think it's not unreasonable for us to consider whether there is a short-term approach the county might take to the economic hit that would occur with a short lead time. And then the third thing is, as all colleagues have indicated, the overall diversification of our economy is the resilience of our economy is, I think, the key to surviving the unexpected, unforeseen or short lead time closure of this plant. I do think could usefully, going back to the economic study, I think we could usefully use some metrics as to how the economic impact of Diablo Canyon fits in with the larger economy, and how do we know when we have diversified our economy sufficiently? You know, what can we come up with some metric to say, yes, our economy is robust. Should Diablo close on short notice, this would be the effect. And if it were more robust, the effect would be less. If it were less robust, the effect would be more. So I think that there's still some work to be done in assessing the overall economic impact relative to what exists now and what we hope might exist in our economy in the future. But I think in terms of direction to staff today, it would be useful for us to speak to the question of prudent reserves to keep the county organization going. That's what we have most direct effect over. I'd be interested in supervisors' thoughts on that. Mr. Hill.
Yeah, a couple of things that you picked up on, Mr. Chair, that I think are valuable. I do think if we're going to look at reserves, we're going to have to look at investment and policy and plan possibilities too. I mean, if at some point in the future, without a doubt, we're not going to be receiving this kind of money, how does the county expect that it will make up for that? I don't know that we can just save our way to having, somewhere between $5 and $10 million a year that would go missing just in terms of the general fund. So I guess you'd have to identify more than just, do we just sock it all away until we know we have enough money to make up for the general fund loss? It would have to be something more. Obviously, it'd have to be more than that. As to the part about evaluating the economic context of nuclear power, that seems far more detailed than. I mean, I guess, and I'm interested in it, and certainly we've talked about it. If we're looking at the NRC's post-Fukushima protocols and some of these other things, we would certainly have to hire an outside consultant to track this in a way that essentially is being tracked right now by the company. We're just going to somehow get a better sense so that we can get a.
If I could, on that, I mean, that's the company tracking it in its interest. I think we should track it in our interest as well. And given the importance of Diablo Canyon and the fact that we are the only county with an operating nuclear power plant in the state, I wonder whether a case could be made that is something we should spend some effort to understand.
Yeah, I would be interested in seeing. I think that would have to be an entirely standalone analysis, and I would be interested in seeing how that might be constructed. But I think that there's great value in looking at that. I don't see, other than the obvious things we do when things happen, even in turns in economy, there's things in place already. Short term is, I'm not sure that we can do much more than say what's available and what we would do. And, you have a $30 million budget gap my first year in office, and everybody makes cuts. We know that. So, again, I think we need to divide between what we want to do in terms of helping to, which is separate, evaluating if you want to evaluate the economic context of the continued operation of the plant, that seems like a very reasonable endeavor. If we want to put some more money into economic development efforts, that seems like a reasonable, effort in terms of continuing to diversify. I still have the question, and I don't know that there is an answer, and that may be part of what you were suggesting too, of evaluating the impacts and potential depreciation of having a nuclear waste repository in our county.
Yes, absolutely.
What is there a way to somehow get an appraisal or some sort of evaluation of that? It's striking to me that other communities that have nuclear reactors haven't done more to be aggressive towards the federal government's failure on this critical policy, considering that plants are being relicensed all the time without there being an answer to the waste issue. And so I would want maybe part of the evaluation of the economic context of nuclear energy to look at the waste aspect as part of that larger analysis. And I see that as a really valuable way for us to look out ahead and be prepared. And so those are my follow-up on yours.
Mr. Meacham?
Without beating this thing up any further, I think we could get a lot of information about what did some of the other areas that have either shut down or have a decline in their nuclear output relative to their economy. What did it do to them? And how can we kind of take a look at that to see what could be the possibilities for us? I'm not interested in a really extended study either. I think all of us have already expressed the issue of spent fuel. I don't know how we deal with that. That's something that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is going to have to deal with. Personally, I'm not really interested in another big study. I think PG&E has continued to do these studies, and I think that they're going to continue to provide us with information that will be relevant to our discussion. And so I don't know what direction we need to go with at this point in time. But
Ms. Ray?
Just again to refocus in the same way. Again, I think that the question before us today is whether to accept this study, and I think that it sounds like we're in agreement that we're ready to accept this study. The question is, do we need to do more? And so perhaps one of the things that I'm hearing my colleagues talk about is having some kind of a contingency plan in place of what this might look like, and have that written down, and anticipate as much as we can and work with the EVC to do that. But in terms of what we're doing today, I think, again, staying on the direction to staff of whether or not we're going to accept this existing study or seek, again, the peer review or an independent study for this particular piece of the puzzle of what is the direct economic impact of Diablo on our economy. I'm satisfied that we've got the answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Buckshine?
Yes, let me just offer up a few things, if I may, from what I heard, that I think everybody's on board, and try to pin down anything a little more specific. It generally sounds like this study, there's no need to replicate this specific study. It gives us a general sense of the economic impact. With respect to us studying reserves and designations and contingencies, we can certainly do that. I don't see that being particularly difficult. As I mentioned earlier, in the financial forecast, the industry target is about 20% to have in reserves and designations, and we're right about that target. And the premise for having that figure is a few things. They're intended to have reserves and designations in place, one, to deal with fluctuations in revenue cycles. Some communities are more dependent upon sales tax than others on transient occupancy tax, or not a very diversified economy, and they see bigger swings in their revenues than frankly what we do. We're largely property tax and then state and federally revenue driven. We don't see the big swings. It's also to deal with the unknown, whether it's a natural disaster, man-made disaster, or in this case, some type of economic impact, such as the closure of a major employer. I would broaden this beyond really the closure of a nuclear power plant. It's really about the closure of a major employer. We could evaluate if we think our economy is not as diversified as we think it should be, and there would be essentially an outlier impact with the closure of Diablo. Do we need to increase our reserves and designations beyond the 20% target? Certainly something we can report back on. With respect to tracking the cost of post-Fukushima requirements from economics study, that's one we'll have to dig into a little bit to see what options exist. I think as Supervisor Hill noted, I believe industry is doing that rather closely. We can see what a type of information we can glean, but my sense was the thought there might need to be a more independent, or at least a desire for a more independent assessment of that impact. We'll have to dig into that one and report back should your board want to go there. And same with along the lines of trying to put a dollar value on the impact of on-site storage. I'm not quite sure how to go about quantifying that, but we could do some research.
Mr. Hill?
Yeah, that's what I was hoping to. I do think that we need to at least look at, even if it's, we may not be able to get to, it would be nice to see if there's a way to draft a proposal to have an independent analysis of the, of the economic context for the continuation of the plant as Supervisor Gibson pointed out, both in its regulatory and market contexts, and also looking at any way to potentially quantify the impacts of the waste. That's a separate thing. I don't know, if we can accomplish that by hiring an industry expert to evaluate that independently for us, I think we should. It's not it's the old, the decisions that whether PG&E or any other nuclear operator has to make are going to be made, obviously independent of us. So I think that seems reasonable, and everything else seems we could probably designate some of the money we were trying to set aside towards further economic development efforts would be the most reasonable way to go about it. So I would move that we've given staff direction, so we accept the report, and staff seems to have captured direction. So I don't know if there's anything else.
Do you have a second? As I understand your motion, it is move the staff direction that's been part of this discussion.
Correct.
Is there a second? Second. Thank you, Mr. Meacham. Seeing no further discussion, we'll just take it on a voice vote. All in favor, aye. Aye. Opposed, none. Thank you. We'll look forward to continuing this discussion. I would propose we press on.